Yeah, as long as you get that budget out, and then you also get that budget out, as long as you do that budget out, as long as you get that budget out, you know, you get the budget out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Councilwoman? Are we, that's just. I'm right here.
Same thing I do.
Yeah, you're gonna look at it. I did. This is the task force. I want to make sure I'm in the right meeting.
Good afternoon. Attending the meeting today. Today you have joined the City of Providence Housing Price Task Force. And today is May 8th. And Madam Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Chairwoman Harris,
Present.
Vice Chairman Espino, absent. Councilwoman Graves,
Yeah.
Councilwoman Peterson,
Here.
Councilor Rogers, absent. 3 present, 2 absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you. And let the record show also that Pro Temp Machado is joining us today. And can I have a motion to enter this and to our records as Exhibit 2B? So motion been made by Councilwoman Peterson, second by Councilwoman Graves. All in favor? Aye. All right. Madam Clerk. Could you please read the first item, Mr.
Presentation on the Rhode Island Continuum of Care from Elizabeth Yoko and Ben Darden.
So that must be the two at the end of the table. How are you? Thank you for bringing that your presentation before us today. We are excited to learn more about what's happening in the housing world. And so we definitely had heard from the database that put the entry in.
Coalition to End Homelessness.
Coalition to End Homelessness. And we are excited about hearing from you today. Now, I want to do this a little different. We're gonna ask that every now and then you stop and allow us to probably catch up or a post chat or whatever. And that way we can get our questions in. Unfortunately, we have a hard shuttle off at 5:15 for the other committees to get set up. But in the meantime, we are looking forward to hearing from you today. Where do we start?
All right, well, I'm gonna get us started.
Introduce yourself for the record, please.
My name is Elizabeth Fiotto. And I'm here on behalf of the Continuum of Care today, and Ben and I are going to talk to you a lot more about what a Continuum of Care means and why we're here on their behalf. That is part of our presentation. That everybody, it looks like, has the slides in front of them. You do as well. Okay, great. And are they? Do we need to share them for the group on Zoom? Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your help with that. So if you go to slide 2, it has the agenda we're going to take you through today. I'm going to start by introducing you to the responsibilities of the Continuum of Care and tell you a little bit more about our governance structure and how we conduct our business. We're going to skip code of conduct for you today, even though it's on the slide in front of you, and then I'm going to hand it off to Ben, and he's going to talk more about our annual funding competition and our coordinated entry system, which we thought were the topics that might be of most interest to this body and the public. First, I will just start, and you can go to the next slide, slide number 3, please. Oh, sure, take your time. Oh, okay. All right, well, on slide 3, it shows responsibilities of the Continuum of Care. So I just wanted to pause here and talk a little bit about the concept of what a Continuum of Care is and why we're here to talk with you about it today. So Continuum of Care is a phrase from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and it really it reflects HUD's concept of how it likes to localize its funding around the issue of ending homelessness. So in the 80s, when the federal government began funding homeless initiatives throughout the country, they realized that what would end homelessness in the subways of New York City is very different than would end homelessness on the islands of Hawaii in rural Alaska, in Iowa, in Utah, and here in Rhode Island. And so they came up with a concept called the continuum of care, which is a local jurisdiction that the jurisdiction itself sets and decides. And that local jurisdiction would be the policy and funding lead on behalf of the federal government in those local jurisdictions. And the idea is you have local experts making the policy and funding decisions whenever and however possible. Now, HUD, of course, gave us a framework of regulations that we do have to work within. We don't have complete authority here at the local level. And all of our funding does roll up to HUD to be approved, but really they do delegate a lot of their authority, to us here locally at the Rhode Island Continuum of Care. So Rhode Island decided to establish a statewide continuum of care. So we have the RICOC, the Rhode Island Continuum of Care oversees policy and funding around ending homelessness throughout the entire state. But it is just a subset of that funding in those policy decisions, and I'll tell you more about where those lines are in the presentation today. Any questions about that much before I move on to some of the details? So the if we go to slide 4, it starts to summarize some of the requirements I mentioned that HUD still does have for us as continuums of care. We have to have a strategic plan in place to prevent and end homelessness. We need to count the number of people experiencing homelessness. At least every other year. We here in Rhode Island do it at least annually. It's called our point in time count. We do it in partnership with the Coalition to End Homelessness, who it sounds like I presented to you and perhaps covered that a little bit earlier this year. The continuum of care is also responsible to conduct gaps analysis, so we'll get opportunities to shift and adjust policy or funding to fill gaps in our strategic planning. And we are responsible to oversee a funding application, at least annually. Recently, it's been even more often. So moving on to the next slide, I believe it's slide 5. The COC board accomplishes most of its work.
I'm sorry, before you move to that next slide, my question is, you decide on who gets the funding, or is this a coalition of people who get the funding and you oversee it? How is that?
Are you asking us specifically or the continuum of care?
I don't know which one.
Yeah.
Who's overseeing?
Well, let me
who's overseeing the funding?
Yes, so the continuum of care oversees the funding locally on behalf of HUD, but HUD is the ultimate authority on the funding.
Okay, so they already know who's going to get funding.
Well, Ben is going to talk to you a little bit later about the competition that we run every year, and that's how the board makes recommendations to HUD, and HUD ultimately approves them for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilwoman.
How long have you been, this has been established?
The continuum of care, that's a great question. Since the mid 2000s, I think the current Rhode Island continuum of care has been established, but before that, a bunch of the same partners were convening regularly and making policy recommendations. So I can find out the exact year that started. Other questions?
Not right now, but I need to trigger something. Thank you.
We'll line them up for you.
So locally, the Rhode Island Continuum of Care is comprised of its membership and its board of directors. And the board of directors is elected through membership. So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about the membership first. It's a broadly diverse group of people. It includes people with lived experience of homelessness, people with experience professionally working in the field of ending homelessness, public agencies, city, state, local governments, and advocates also. And from that membership, I believe we have about 50 people on membership right now. They have a couple of tasks that the membership supports annually. They elect their board of directors to represent them. And they approve their governance charter, which really is the structure that outlines how they conduct their business, and how they'll do their decision making. Our membership does meet 4 times a year. And we have no cap on the number of people who can join membership or who can join membership from a certain organization. We really value broad, diverse experience on the membership. However, if there are multiple people from the same organization on membership, we do ask that one person is designated the voting member. We conduct an invitation at least annually to invite new members to join the continuum of care. It's a public process, and we really do a lot of work with our current membership to do some gaps analysis and who we might be missing expertise from in our group and invite them to join. Next slide, please.
Once I'm in grade.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry, you have the floor.
50 members are very competent. Is it because it's statewide or why is there so many?
Members.
It's because we want a broad and diverse group of interested stakeholders to pull expertise from. So I'll tell you in a few slides about the paid staff that we have supporting the continuum of care, but the spoiler is that there are not many. And so we conduct most of our business through committee work. And so we really rely on interested and invested stakeholders to inform our decision making. So that again, we're making the best decisions locally here for Rhode Island. But it is a lot, it is a large membership. Luckily, we have vested stakeholders, and so, getting a quorum has not been a problem with our membership, even though it's larger in recent years.
Councilwoman Peterson.
As members, do they pay dues or is it just, do you donate, anything along those lines?
No, there's no donations or dues. We do ask members to commit to attending those 4 meetings a year, and so volunteering that time if they're not able to attend through their professional work.
Okay.
We do pay we do pay stipends to people with lived experience of homelessness if they are not being reimbursed through any sort of professional mechanisms to attend our meetings. We do reimburse and compensate them for their time, but those are the only people who would reimburse for their time directly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any others?
I got it. That's all right.
That's great.
You're good. You let us know what's going on.
So if you go to this slide, perfect. So there were a couple responsibilities of full membership, but really the bulk of the decision making done by the continuum of care is done by the board of directors. So again, quarterly at their membership meetings, the membership elects representatives to represent them on their board of directors. And our board has 17 members. Our governance charter requires that at least 3 of those 17 are people with lived experience of homelessness. At least 2 of those 17 members are youth action board members, which are youth under age 25 who have experienced homelessness and who are leading our youth homelessness work and planning work in the state. We must have at least 2 members from the homeless service provider community and agencies on the board of directors. We also seek to have representatives of the subpopulations the continuum of care serves as board members. So some examples are, we know there are veterans experiencing homelessness, and we have a board member representing the veteran community. We know there's a large intersection between domestic violence and experiencing homelessness, and so we have a board member representing domestic violence. Those are just a couple of examples. And then we do say that no agency may have more than 1 member on the board at any given time. Next slide, please. So I do like to mention the difference between the continuum of care and the Housing Resource Commission that we have here in the state of Rhode Island. So the continuum of care funds housing programs primarily, and some systems investments, and those are planning grants, which I'll tell you what those are later, but the short story is they pay for positions like Ben and mine to do this work on behalf of the continuum. We also pay an HMIS lead and coordinated entry lead agencies. But the bulk of our funding at the continuum of care pays for permanent housing opportunities. So either permanent supportive housing, which is housing without a time limit, and that includes wraparound or deep service provision for the people who are in those housing opportunities. And then we also fund rapid rehousing, which is a time limited housing intervention for people who have experienced homelessness. That also includes some services, but not as deep or long-term services as in permanent supportive housing. However, there are a lot of other funds in our state that contribute to the work in ending homelessness. Like some examples are shelter funding, and shelter funding is not an eligible expense of the continuum of care, and we do not pay for shelters. So our colleagues at the Housing Resources Commission and in the Department of Housing at the state oversee those emergency solutions grants and other funding that funds shelter opportunities in Providence and throughout the state. So the continuum of care I mentioned earlier is the policy lead on a lot of decision making locally, but we definitely work closely with the Department of Housing and to inform or to collaborate on their policy making and decisions. Any other questions about this slide?
Councilwoman Graves.
Percentage wise, you said permanent housing, wraparound housing, time limited. And basically the other comes under another heading, shelter. I love the three of the names. What kind of percentage wise is it with the
What percentage are we funding?
No, if it's permanent housing, how many permanent housing, basically, I know it probably fluctuates, but in the ballpark figure.
Yeah, so rapid rehousing is a newer intervention than permanent supportive housing, so we fund less of it, but we've had more luck getting rapid rehousing in recent years. So I'd say, I can get you the exact numbers, but I'd say we're probably about 2/3 permanent supportive housing and 1/3 rapid rehousing. But if you look at what we've been able to invest in recently, particularly for survivors of domestic violence, we've been very successful in recent years in bringing in new rapid rehousing funding for that population specifically.
Thank you.
Right.
Councilwoman.
Perhaps you covered this up. What is the current budget that you have?
The COC just passed $11 million annually that we oversee for the state. I think it's 11.4 million. And like I said, some of that is coordinated entry, HMIS, and planning dollars, but the bulk of it is housing, either rapid rehousing.
You're the umbrella.
Correct.
The umbrella.
And we have 11.1 million in that umbrella.
That's awesome. That's increased over time.
It's
Wow.
increased a lot.
That's
We're very
amazing.
proud of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
About 6 years ago, we were in the mid fives, and we've doubled our funding in recent years. And we're actually positioned to go over 12 million next year. I mentioned our youth board members and the youth money that we've been awarded recently, so that will join sort of our umbrella, as you put it, in next year and bring us over 12 million.
Yeah. So I know you probably gonna get into the Housing Resource Commission, or you're done with that?
I can answer more questions about it, yeah.
Well, my thing is, so my question is around, you coordinate with the Rhode Island Housing Resource Commission and leverage the dollars too? Does the state,
Yes, when we can, we do. So the COC lets any federal match, any federal dollars be used as match in our programs to the extent that other federal programs allow for their funding to be used as match, we absolutely encourage that leveraging. And it happens quite a bit between the COC and the CA. The Consolidated Homeless Fund is sort of the braided funding source that the HRC oversees. And we encourage leveraging with that as much as possible.
Chair, continue? Or should we just continue the presentation?
Let's
Okay.
hear more
I'll
about
have
the
more.
presentation. She might get.
Sounds
some of the answers.
I know time,
That's all.
Okay,
I see that.
so next slide, please. So I've mentioned the board a few times already, but really it's their responsibility to be sure that the regulations that HUD has set for continuums of care are met. And so they are ultimately responsible to hold those membership meetings I discussed, to convene committees and work groups to address emerging issues and to conduct their business. I'll tell you a lot more about our committees in just a minute. And recently, a newer board function has been, HUD requires them to oversee the coordinated entry system, which Ben is not too much about a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the board, to conduct their business, meets monthly. We certainly can and do convene special meetings as needed. To conduct additional business. All of our meetings, like yours, I imagine, are subject to the Open Meetings Act we have here in Rhode Island. So our agendas are posted publicly, in accordance with that act. And all issues put before them are decided by a majority of the board members present. Next slide, please. I don't know that we need to take too much time talking through the Open Meetings Act, but this is, I do like to say that that the board's work is all open to the public, and they really do listen and engage with the public as much as possible in our meetings. We have public comment at the top and at the bottom of every agenda, and the board, carefully considers those comments during its meetings and obviously in follow-up and the work we do on their behalf. Next slide, please. The board elects a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary from among the board. Our current chair is Peter Eason with the Providence Housing Authority. Our current vice chair is Andrew Friedman with the City of Providence Planning Department, and our current secretary is Jillian Lossmer with the Warren Center in Westerly. So I mentioned they're elected by the board to serve on their behalf. They serve 2-year terms. And our governance charter does require that the chair and vice chair have no conflicts of interest with COC business. So they can participate in all of our committees, and specifically our funding decision making committee, which of course no one is allowed to participate in who might have a conflict. Next slide, please.
Who was the vice chair?
So I've mentioned our committees a couple of times today. This slide shows you our membership board and committee structure. These are what the row on the bottom are what I would call our standing committees. So we certainly have additional work groups that are convened that are not represented on this slide. And apologies if the text is very small, but the board really does accomplish most of its work through these committees. So I'm sure you may understand where the board is simply not able to get into all the weedy details of all of these important policy decisions in their meetings. And so they really lean on their committees to make them recommendations for action. And so whenever I make these types of public presentations on the board's behalf, I always like to clarify that members of the public are welcome, encouraged, and encouraged to participate in our committees. So any of these groups that sound of interest, your expertise would be welcome to engage at our committee level. And that's really the best way to get involved in the recommendations and decision making that the board is doing. I won't read you through the committees, but we do have, I mentioned our funding committee. We have one that oversees our database that you mentioned earlier, the homeless management information system. We have subpopulation specific committees, a funding committee. We have one overseeing our coordinated entry system. So, any questions on that before I move on?
Continue.
All right, so next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we do also have some staff support. So the board of directors does have memorandums of understanding or agreement with some agencies to conduct work on their behalf. So the first one is called collaborative applicant. That's another HUD term that they made up, which our current collaborative applicant for the continuum of care is Rhode Island Housing. So Ben and I both work and are employed by Rhode Island Housing. As the collaborative applicant, Rhode Island Housing is responsible to submit the funding competition, to run the funding competition, and then ultimately submit it to HUD. And then also provide technical assistance to the grantees statewide and really oversee the operations of the board of directors on their behalf. In addition to Rhode Island Housing as a collaborative applicant, the board has agreements with the Coalition to End Homelessness as its HMIS lead, running the database for the work in ending homelessness. And they are one of the coordinated entries, CES lead agencies, and the other is Crossroads Rhode Island. Any questions? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to talk to you a bit more in depth about the funding competition that we oversee, at least annually, and the coordinated entry system.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So as Elizabeth alluded to,
Ben, could you please introduce yourself for the record?
Ben Darby, I'm one of the BCSA planner at Rhode Island Housing. Pronouns are dependents.
Thank you.
So yearly there is a CSE competition, an annual competition run locally in Rhode Island. I think we hope that it's eventually not yearly, maybe biannually, but so as the collaborative applicant, we run and are responsible for kind of shepherding that application through and submitting it to HUD. So currently, when we do the annual competition, and Elizabeth alluded to this too, that the types of projects that are funded through this competition are permanent housing projects, which are split up into permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, coordinated entry projects, HMIS, which is the homeless management information system, and the planning grant. So we are designated as the collaborative applicants. Each year there are opportunities for new projects through a couple different streams. So there are bonus funds, and HUD will announce different types of bonus funds. It depends on the year. There are domestic violence bonus funds, which I think recently have been the bonuses that have been in the competition. And we have gotten, this past year, we got 2 grants through DV bonus for Sojourner House. And then there is reallocation of existing projects. So if projects are underspending or this, they can voluntarily reallocate, where the funding committee can make recommendations on reallocating grants that are underperforming or have not been spent. And those reallocated funds go to new projects. The goal each year of the application is to increase our overall performance. So there's a number of things within the application. There's system performance measures that we get rated on, and other types of narrative questions that informs our total score. And the higher the score, the more funds are available from HUD. Next slide. So each year, locally, when we run the competition, the COC board establishes performance scoring metrics for the competition. So as renewal, and it's a little bit complicated how it happens, but renewal permanent housing projects are ranked based on this performance and scoring metrics, these metrics, and then there are separate metrics for new projects. And then projects like coordinated entry and HMIS and the planning grant, which are really important for how the system works, aren't they don't compete against the permanent housing projects for funding, right? So and the board votes on the metrics for the competition, and those are really brought by recommendation from the planners, but also from the different committees that can get feedback on what those performance metrics look like. And those are posted publicly on our website, if you're interested. And then if we have an RFP for new projects within the competition, we'll submit it, we'll have a public RFP, and then folks submit letters of interest based on the priorities that the board sets around what types of new projects we're willing to fund, or the board is willing to fund. And then, so the renewal projects and the new applications are reviewed and scored by the funding committee, which is one of the standing committees. And there are nobody who's applying for those funds can be on that committee, so no providers committee.
Thank you for this.
Yeah, so there's no conflict of interest. Yeah, and this ranking is based on policy set by the board. So, yeah. Does anybody, I want to pause, does anybody have a question about that?
Councilwoman Peterson?
Excuse me, you said, is it agencies only that apply? Or like in cities and towns?
Cities and towns, yeah.
Yeah,
cities
and
towns.
public housing.
Communities.
Yeah,
Apparently, we cannot apply.
Councilman
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tata, you have the floor.
I'm not in the
give you the
committee.
floor before you have it, so I can take it back.
That's right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So currently we can't apply because the chair and the vice chair are members of the. Oh, this is a different program.
Well, if, so I don't fully understand the relationship between the vice chair and the council. But if any agencies of local government are eligible to apply, and typically if there was a conflict of interest, that the person who might have that interest would recuse themselves, and then if needed to re-explore an officer position, you would just do it that way. It wouldn't make you ineligible to apply.
Thank you.
That's the question.
Yes,
Great.
I just want to put it out there too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
okay, next.
Then, sorry, before you continue, Chris.
Thank you. The planning grants, can you explain a little bit more about what type of plan, what those grants are for, what kind of projects those fund?
Yeah, so the planning grant, for example, funds my position, which, and part of Elizabeth's position. And really, a lot of the work we do is to make sure the functions of the COC run. So like not running committees, but supporting committee chairs, supporting the board, making sure that we have the right types of policy recommendations are making it from committees to the board, supporting questions, working on the collaborative application. All these types of things that keep the COC running day to day. And I think it's capped at 3% of the total application.
Right now, it's 3%. So that $11.4 million that you were discussing earlier, 3% of that comes to Rhode Island Housing as the collaborative applicant for the planning project. And then the board can engage with Rhode Island Housing if it wants to procure for contracts, and we do quite a bit. So there are board responsibilities like monitoring each of its grantees, conducting this competition events describing. So we use our procurement processes, and engage in contracts on the board's behalf for those activities.
Thank you.
We also use planning dollars to pay those constituent stipends for meeting attendance. Those are just a few examples.
Councilwoman Peterson.
Your application process for these grants or these opportunities, funding opportunities, once a year, multiple times a year, different times a year?
It's a great question. So 2 years ago, I would have told you once a year. But since we had 2 competitions last year, and 2 competitions the year before. There's one, what I would call typical continuum of care competition annually. It usually runs in the summer, starting early July. But we are ultimately on HUD decides when it starts, and so it does shift a bit. But usually it's in the summer. Additionally, 2 years ago, we had the youth projects that we was a different competition. And then last year we ran a competition that was ultimately not selected for funding by HUD, but we tried to secure funding for the continuum of care to address unsheltered homelessness. So that's another. We're expecting 2 to be this year too. We're expecting 2 to be this year as well, I guess I should say. So our summer competition, and then we believe there will be one in the fall.
Ben, you may continue.
Thank you. Yeah, so the internal competition, so what requires that we conduct an open and well-publicized competition. So you'll see our performance metrics, our timelines on our website. So COCs are required to either reject an application or rank it. So when we get submissions for applications and scoring, we either have to accept it and put it into the application or reject the project. Applications are funded by HUD in order of their ranking. So there's a little bit of complexity in that there's these things, tier 1 and tier 2, and basically tier 1 funding is, as long as HUD has the money in their budget, is almost guaranteed, but tier 2 is more competitive. So tier 2 applications, which would be the applications that score lower on our internal competition using the performance metrics. Those applications or those projects compete against other projects nationally, and they might lose funding depending on how much money HUD has. And so, yeah, unless the COC scores at the top of the national competition in terms of our total score, project ranked at the very bottom or in tier 2 might lose funding, probably will lose some funding. All right, next slide, please. So coordinated entry, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, is it's a mandated part of our continuum of care. And basically, it is a way that HUD said that we need to make access to these resources more equitable. So in 2017 is when the rule was finalized. The way that folks experiencing homelessness access permanent housing options and in Rhode Island shelter options as well through continuum of care funded grants is through the coordinated entry system. So we have a scarcity of shelter beds and we have a scarcity of housing resources through the city. And so basically to make sure that folks who are the most vulnerable are getting those scarce resources, I think that we need to prioritize, have a way of prioritizing who, basically determining who is the most vulnerable, and then have a system to refer those folks into beds. It used to be first come, first serve, which has all types of problems in terms of like who's accessing the housing. It's not as equitable as coordinated entry. And yeah, this slide has there's a lot of different components to coordinated entry. Outreach teams working on doing crisis or housing assessments with folks on the street. They also, we also do assessments via phone, email, or walk-in. So that the Coalition to End Homelessness is this coordinated entry lead, and they have a call center where you can call and do a crisis assessment or a housing assessment. Part of the coordinated entry system is also diversion. So the assessments basically are the ones that we use here are locally created, and they assess for vulnerability. So there's a crisis assessment for shelter and a housing assessment for permanent housing resources. And diversion is sort of before you get there. Diversion is part of the system that Crossroads is the lead on, also called housing problem solving, where you try to have conversations with folks and provide short-term resources so that they don't actually need to enter the homeless system, right? So if somebody has some other sort of family resource, with this things as security deposit or something like that. The idea is that we can leverage, we have the scarcity, so we can leverage some short-term resources and sort of case compensate. Some folks won't even have to enter the home services system. So that's one part of coordinated entry as well. I'm gonna stop there though, because I'm sure.
And I'll be Councilman and I'll call myself.
No, that's.
Okay, I want to get back to the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Besides domestic violence, what else do you consider vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question and a really tough question. And CSCs across the country, there was a tool that most CSCs used to use called the BI SPDAD, which actually.
Say that again.
I'm sorry.
Say it faster.
The BI SPDAD, and I'm not gonna remember what SPDAD stands for, but the BI stands for Vulnerability Index. And it was a tool that actually came out of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, back when coordinated entry was starting. And then the SPDAD was to make it, over the years, there were iterations to it. So there's different iterations of the SPDAD, and the SPDAD is longer than the original vulnerability index. And sort of, there's been a bunch of research on the BI SPDAD, and HUD has started telling communities that, and other communities in CSC were realizing this before HUD said it, but also like encouraging communities not to use the BI SPDAD because it has, it's pretty inequitable. So the sort of outcomes that come from it, I think, have been shown to be inequitable. So people are moving away from the BI SPDAD, and here in Rhode Island, we have a locally developed tool for both the crisis assessment and the housing assessment. And the types of things that are on the crisis assessment focused on more, well, so I mean, like length of homelessness, whether or not there's a question about substance use, there's a question about physical disability and mobility, there's a question about, the top of my head, there's a question about mental health, there's a question about if you've been experienced community violence, or if you've experienced domestic violence. So the crisis assessment focuses on maybe the idea is it's shorter than the housing assessment because it focuses on there was a group that got together to determine the new crisis assessment, and it really focuses on what are the things that make people really vulnerable to dying on the street, right? And so that's how we prioritize for shelter. And then the housing assessment is a bit longer. We recently redid the crisis assessment and are in the process of revisiting the housing assessment. So that was kind of a long answer, but it's really tough to figure out how to prioritize, like who's the most vulnerable. It's a really tough question, and different communities do it different ways. But yeah.
It's a question we hope we don't have to ask forever.
Yeah.
You know, like, it's really just as Ben described, because of the scarcity of these resources, that HUD, you know, leaning into this coordinated entry concept so heavily.
Yeah, and while we were convening the crisis assessment work group, which is a group that met recently to redo our crisis assessment, it really came up a lot with everybody. I mean, nobody wants to be doing it. It's only because we have a scarcity of resources. Like everybody who is staying on the street is vulnerable, and coming to some sort of scheme to determine who is more vulnerable or less vulnerable does not feel good, and we don't think we should be doing it, you know, but it's a way to prioritize the very scarce resources we have.
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
Councilwoman Peterson.
What's your turnaround time for coordinated entry once you've done all of these components? Like how long does it take for the process?
For somebody to be like matched to a resource.
Right.
It depends. For shelter, off the top of my head, I wouldn't know. It really, the list is dynamic. And so it's hard it depends on the score. So somebody, if they're lower acuity, could be on the list for a long time, right? Because other people are being prioritized ahead of them.
Right.
I'm sure that the coalition had the average time. Off the top of my head, I don't know it. Some people are going to wait a lot longer because they're going to score much lower on the assessment.
You just answered my question. I had an opportunity to be a part of an encampment, to visit and be a part of it for about 1 month. just learning, just trying to learn.
Yeah.
And I heard people say my score is low. What does that mean, your score is low? And this is what that means, when
Yeah.
they hear that, the reason they don't have housing is because they haven't scored high enough.
Yeah,
And it's certainly possible that somebody with a comparatively lower score might wait a long time for a shelter.
And they know that, you say that to them, you're
I
honest
think
to them.
most people do, yes.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a really tough process, but I think being honest with people about what the process is like shows them, you know, some level of dignity, so it's good to be honest about. If you have a low score, I think it's good to be honest about it and explain that, right? So. Yeah.
I wish there was a world without a list.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
me too.
Councilman, Child.
Thank you. Along those lines, once they receive their scores and they're low, are there other services that, some way, that they provided to help them elevate that score? And I have to explain.
I think the score is low because they're on the list.
Yeah, not necessarily to elevate the score, because the score basically gets at vulnerability, so you probably wouldn't want to elevate the score, right? Like you get housed, but
Yeah.
you know, but there are other services and partnerships and like outreach teams working with folks to get connected to mainstream vouchers or, you know, housing choice vouchers or other types of things. I mean, it still is true that there is a lack of housing resources even outside of the CSC, but a lot of great community partners who work to connect folks to other types of resources that aren't CSC resources. Yeah.
Councilman.
Can you speak about, in terms of, women and children, that are perhaps are not in any of the systems? For example, here, and I read that there's close to about 200 single moms or with children that are homeless. But they may be doubling up with another family and so forth. What role do you guys play in that?
Yeah, so HUD has a definition of homelessness. It is different than some of the other federal definitions of homelessness. And one of the differences is families who are doubled up. So in the schools, a McKinney-Vento liaison can work with a family that's doubled up and counts that family as homeless. Unfortunately, in HUD's definition, a doubled up family does not meet the definition of homelessness. So our shelters and housing programs cannot serve families who are living in doubled up situations. So it's a very unfortunate reality of the homeless definition we're working in.
One more, and then we have to continue because.
Yeah. So are we doing anything to change that, or at least complement that at the state level to change those, to service them? But changing a law or a policy. Well, I know the federal definition is much tougher, but at the local level, at the state level, to try to support that more
Yeah,
so.
I mean, there's no reason that state funding and state policy needs to use the very prescriptive federal definition of homelessness. And we certainly don't encourage that in any of our work. We recognize a family is actually homeless when they're living doubled up. We just can't offer them these particular resources to resolve their crisis because it would not be eligible. We wouldn't want to jeopardize the resource. But we work with a number of partners, especially the education field and all the partners we have around the state, closely with them. And certainly, when a family falls into a HUD defined homeless status, offer them all of our resources and support them with all the other service partnerships.
I'd like to invite your vice chair to the conversation, Emily Freeman, please come to the table.
Jump in quickly.
Yeah, it's okay. Help us out a little bit.
Good evening, everyone. Emily Freeman, Director of Bishop Housing and Community Development. I did just want to raise that the as Elizabeth mentioned, there is McKinney-Vento funding that flows through to the Providence School Department that specifically looks at the issue of underserved youth and children potentially experiencing homelessness or doubled up in the schools. So it might be an interesting exercise for this committee to take a look at whether or not the school department is taking full advantage of that funding, how much we receive, and what types of programs they have that potentially could be amplified by city or state funding. What was the name of that fund? I'm sorry, McKinney-Vento,
Bento?
VENTO.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we should do just that, for sure.
To answer your question too, we definitely advocate to the federal government about the gap in their definition of homelessness. I mean, one of the responsibilities they delegate to local continuums of care is gap analysis, and so we definitely at every opportunity, our continuum of care is advocated for flexibility and broadening of that homeless definition. So far, it has not come to, there's, been no change or progress and.
Keep at it.
Yeah.
Repeat it over and over, every chance you get.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that there are other federal agencies like Health and Human Services who count folks who are doubled up or captured as experiencing homelessness, but HUD just doesn't. Literal homelessness is HUD's definition. Yeah. Okay.
All right, then.
Yeah, next slide, please. So these are the two lead agencies for our coordinated entry system. So Crossroads runs the housing problem solving side of the work, which is diversion and rapid resolution, which is kind of what I talked about earlier. There's some more technical definitions of those, but really trying to divert folks from the homelessness services system through like quick resources that are short-term and can fix the situation. And then Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness is the CE lead for continuum care, ESG, and CHF funded shelter and housing projects. So in Rhode Island, shelter resources are go through coordinated entry, and so do all the housing resources, CSC and CHF housing resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is kind of summarizing some of the stuff that we've already talked about, but just generally the Rhode Island CSC policies and procedures. As a collaborative applicant, we submit the HUD application each year. We try to maximize participation of folks with experience at the board level, but also within committees and membership. We host CSC meetings, so 4 membership meetings a year, and then 12 board meetings. There's an annual review of the CSC governance charter. The process for setting performance standards, those standards are what we use to run the competition. Grantee monitoring procedures, so we're mandated to monitor grantees each year. Right now, we're in the process of monitoring CSC grantees, and we're contracting with the Technical Assistance Collaborative, and it's going well. We're almost done. Coordinated entry protocols. So we have a coordinated entry policy and procedures document that outlines sort of how it works, and that's on our website as well. And then all of this all of the CSC projects should follow housing first principles and policy, and that's kind of infused through all of our projects and policies. Next slide. More policies and procedures. So we have policies and procedures specific to different housing types. So permanent supportive housing standards, rapid rehousing standards, standards around supportive housing case management. So how many visits monthly, things like that. We have a policy at the CSC level on expending grant funds. So I was talking earlier about new project funding. Each year the funding committee has a discussion about reallocating grant funds if they're not fully spent. We have the renewal evaluation policy, which is part of the competition. So evaluating renewal based on performance, the performance metrics that the board approves. agencies can voluntarily reallocate if they're underspending funds and are having trouble, running a CSE program, they can say, voluntarily reallocate some of these funds. Educational services for children and youth, so it's looking for everything then to services, VAWA provisions, which is Violence Against Women Act, which is kind of throughout our housing projects. There are, policy around that, and then HUD Equal Access Rule, which is a rule around housing discrimination and making sure people have access to shelter and housing in a fair and equitable way. A lot of policies. Next slide, please. Okay, the resources the COC provides to funding recipients. So we have a CSC recipient toolkit, which was put together sort of as a guide for all the continuing of care grantees around all of these federal regulations for permanent housing, for rapid rehousing, because it can be very confusing. So that is on our website. We provide guidance on procurement and contracting and liaise between the field office and different CSC grantees. We provide trainings on things like eligibility verification documentation. So as we were sort of talking about earlier, there's these pretty specific definitions of homelessness. So literal homelessness is one definition, and chronic homelessness is a definition. Eligibility criteria for permanent supportive housing, which is probably overcomplicated. And so we provide trainings to grantees around how to document that, what it is, what it means. We have sample policies and procedures for recipient agencies in that toolkit. We do wellness checks with CSC grantees around their spending and how their grants are going. And then we have supportive housing case management standards that we work with grantees on. Any questions?
Yeah, who keeps, I'm just trying to figure out how the database works with what you're doing and how you get your information. Who keeps all of that? Where is that?
Like these types of toolkits and stuff, are you talking about like the data that we use in the system?
The data you use as a system for someone who calls up at the end of the night with no place to live, that, how do you guys coordinate that? I'm just trying to figure out in my head.
Yeah.
Because we learned about the database system last time. And you guys are the funders. That's where I'm.
So the COC funds about half of that database, and the Consolidated Homeless Fund funds approximately the other half. It may not be exactly 50, but we funded in partnership. But you're correct that a lot of our policy and the board's policies oversee how the Coalition to End Homelessness runs the homeless management information system.
And how do you keep the tracking of the numbers of people that are homeless? Is it through you or through the sisters?
Well, we rely a lot on our HMIS lead to do that, but we help guide it, and the board ultimately decides. So we actually recently updated some of the reporting that the board receives on the homeless management database. That was done closely with Ben and I in consultation with the HMIS lead and with the board. So asking them what information they wanted and were interested in, and what we could provide, what the system could deliver.
Yeah. And in terms of total numbers, every year there's a point in time count, which I'm sure the coalition talked about and which we mentioned earlier. But there's also, if you're thinking about people completing assessments and how that flows into HMIS, there is a housing, we call it queue, a housing queue and a crisis or a shelter queue. And so those numbers are real time. So if you have completed an assessment and you're still active on the queue, you can pull, HMIS can pull, or the Coalition to End Homelessness can pull like the total number of people who have a housing assessment done, or the total number of people who have a shelter assessment done or on the queue. So that's how, when somebody does a assessment, how they sort of flow into the database. If that's helpful.
Okay. All right, any more? Ben, are you completing the slide?
That was my last slide.
Yeah, it looked like it was the last slide.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. This is really great information that we did not have before. Is there any burning questions from the committee?
Can I just say,
Councilman Machado?
so I appreciate all the information, especially seeing that one seems to be well funded compared to 15 years ago. I served in the General Assembly and with Senator Sony and I in the Housing Municipal Government Committee and chairman. Really, it seems that, you know, departments and people are actually talking and really making things work. Back then, we used to have about 4,300 people homeless, and now we're like 1,200, I think it was, that was reported at one point, one frame. And I'll leave it at that because I know we're pressed for time, so, but thank you very much.
No, okay. I want to ask a question about, you said this system started like 2017. Did you say, did you?
Coordinated.
The coordinating entry. So you're still probably in your trials and errors. What is some of the things that you feel like is a challenge or something that you, besides not being able to have enough housing stock for people? What else do you find as a challenge?
With coordinated entry, there are a lot. The scarcity that you just mentioned is definitely the biggest challenge, because it forces, very understandably, our clients and even our provider agencies supporting those clients to compete for life-saving resources on behalf of their clients, and that's just a really hard position for everyone to find themselves in. In addition to that, the responsibility of training a statewide system with varied agency capacities, and, you know, throughout the COVID crisis and now coming out of it, all of the capacity challenges that's created is hard. And I think what Ben described earlier about trying to assess folks' vulnerability with tools that we're tasked with designing and implementing and then evaluating, sort of compounds all of those challenges. But at least for myself, in working for the COC, I think I don't believe the system would be equitable if we didn't have some of these structures in place. And so I think it's a fight worth fighting or continuing to work to improve. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, basically agree. I think it's unnaturally a hard system to implement because of the complexity around the situations, which are emergencies, and then figuring out how to rank somebody based on vulnerability in that tool. So I think that there's always going to be implementation issues, but in terms of the idea of coordinated entry, I think it is, you know, what we should be doing. You know, we should, if we have scarce resources, we should be figuring out a way to get the most vulnerable people those resources. So, yeah.
I just want to bring something up that Councilman Machado mentioned, and I'm not quite sure whether that was the question. Did you say there is less of people homeless now than years ago?
It seemed like, yeah, yeah, as far as the numbers.
So I was looking at,
Maybe because they're counting.
Yeah, and that's why it was like, we didn't have these things in place. In fact, the housing resource at that time, and a lot of advocates fought for specific dollars going into a state fund to make sure these things are in place, and that's why I was actually, you know, appreciating the information and also how it's making headways in terms of the providers and communication. You know, we're seeing it now with the issue of the homelessness situation at the Armory, right? So you must be at the table with the state to actually try to coordinate these services and I know for me, as a veteran, that was a big thing. And for families and children, that at one point it was probably like I don't know numbers, but let's say 1,000 of them, and then it really dwindled down because there was resources and there was a well coordinated campaign. The same thing with the family and children. That's why I mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, Dan, thank you so very much. Unless there's something that you want to say, I forgot the spot. Councilwoman, are you good?
Good, this was great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for presenting to us and this information. We would like to know if there is anything that we can do to help bring about change. I don't know what that would be. I know Chris is getting ready to move us to another level eventually, and I hope that we all can play a role in this all together, you know, even with you guys as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, could you read the next item into the records, please?
Presentation of the House and Human Rights Act from Chris Brown, Director of Policy for the Council.
All right, Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief because I know we have Herb right on the tails of this meeting. But the policy team had identified this bill that is before Congress right now. It's House Bill 1708. It is called Housing is a Human Right. This was something that we have brought to Chairwoman Harris and wanted to come today to present it to the rest of the task force members, so you're aware of this proposal. The lead sponsors is Representative Jaya Paul from Washington State and Representative Mang from New York. The purpose of the bill is to address root causes of homelessness, meet the needs of community members experiencing harms from homelessness, transition communities towards providing housing for all, and end penalization of those experiencing homelessness. The bill also calls for major investments into homelessness that would come from the federal government to the states. It calls for $300 billion in essential affordable housing and accessible housing infrastructure, which includes $200 billion in housing and supportive services and $27 billion annually in homelessness services. $100 million annually for community-driven alternatives to the criminalization of people experiencing homelessness. So at the request of Chairman Harris, the policy staff has drafted a letter from, at this point, Leader Harris to go to our federal delegation, as well as the sponsors of this bill. And we are looking for the rest of the housing task force to weigh in as to whether or not you'd like to sign on, and any other council members.
I make a motion that we do.
Okay. So we actually entertained it through a motion. Madam Clerk, did you get that? There's a motion made by Councilwoman Peterson. Oh, I'm sorry, Gray, yeah, motion made by Councilwoman Gray, there are two women, I'm just looking. And second by Councilwoman Peterson to, for the committee to sign on to the letter that's going to our delegation in Congress. So is, all in favor? Aye.
Oh, no.
You're not voting. All right. The ayes have it.
Oh, sure.
Great. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Can you just send us with the bill? Like the-
I will send you all of it. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
And Madam Clerk, should I enter that into the records because we voted on that? What do you think? Hmm? Okay, no, it's, I just wanted to ask first.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Councilwoman Chad.
I would like to be added to that letter as a regular.
Sure. Now, as a
As a regular person.
As a regular person. You're a councilman. You was welcome. Chris.
before we adjourn, I just also want to say that our next meeting of the task force will be, May 22nd. It will be at 5 p.m. And Secretary Pryor will be here to give a presentation to the task force around the Department of Housing and their progress on, the homeless crisis and sheltering people.
Thank you.
very much.
Is that a Monday?
That's a Monday, yep, 2 weeks from today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, if there's no further business before this humble body, I'm gonna call for an adjournment. All in favor? Aye. Second. Then, or live in second. We are in adjournment. Thank you guys.